Good morning, everybody. It's so good, like I said last week, to be able to have people in the room and worship with you in here, to continue to worship with people who are watching online. It is truly beautiful to see what technology can allow us to do. But as we move into the sermon, I just want to be very transparent, open, honest. This message that I'm about to give right now caused me a great deal of anxiety. I think every day this week, I woke up thinking about this. I went to sleep thinking about this. I felt like Jonah because I was trying to find a way to avoid talking about this because I didn't want to, but I knew I had to. And it's funny how God works because every worry that I had, it was like I would get a phone call or an invitation, say, hey, let's go talk. And it was like God was telling me, hey, Jalen, I got you. So today we're going to be talking about prayer and action, especially on the topic of racism. Earlier this year, in February, I shared my experiences in the short 24 years of life that I've had, racism in the church, racism outside of the church. And as I shared my story, a lot of different things happened. Some of you came and talked to me and lamented with me. Some of you prayed with me. Some of you shared your own experiences with racism. Some of you said nothing at all. And honestly, each one of those is fine, is great. I truly appreciated all of them. But like most times in my life that I've seen, I talked about it and nothing happened. It was kind of wore off. Things happened. Life started. COVID-19 happened. And that's okay. But today, we're going to talk about it. And hopefully, from this day forth, we as a church, we as a community, we as the global church can move forward in this process. So if you have your Bibles, open up to James 2. If you don't have your Bibles, if you have a phone that works, if you don't have that, it's going to be on the screen. But we're going to be in James 2. We're going to start in verse 14. And I'm going to read verses 14 through 26. And I'll be reading it from the CSB. It says, "What good is this? What good is it, my brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but does not have works? Can such faith save him? If a brother or sister is without clothes and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, 'Go in peace, stay warm, and be well fed,' but you don't give them what the body needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith, if it doesn't have works, is dead by itself. But someone will say, 'You have faith, and I have works. Show me your faith without works, and I will show you faith by my works.' You believe that God is one. Good. Even the demons believe, and they shudder. Senseless person, are you willing to learn that faith without works is useless? Wasn't Abraham, our father, justified by works in offering Isaac his son on the altar? You see that faith was acted together with his works, and by his works, faith was made complete. And the scripture was filled that says, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness, and he was called God's friend. You see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. In the same way, wasn't Rahab the prostitute also justified by works in receiving the messengers and sending them out by a different route? For just as the body without the spirit is dead, so also faith without works is dead." So lucky for me, the Young Adult D group has been going through the book of James, and this is actually the last passage that we talked about. And if you're a young adult in the room or watching, we meet on Sunday nights at 7. Join us tonight. But anyways, as we unpack this, I want to go back and focus on verses 15 and 16. And to me, James is kind of being sort of a savage. He says, if a brother or sister is without clothes and lacks daily food, and one of you says to them, "Go in peace, stay warm, and be well fed," but you don't give them what the body needs, what good is it? In the same way, faith, if it doesn't have works, is dead by itself. And to me, it was like things like, what's the point of acknowledging a problem? What's the point of saying, hey, I see this, if you're not going to do anything about it? Personally, for me, as you can see, I'm a pretty big boy. I've always been big. I kind of blame my grandma because I would come home from school and she would have a full meal on the table ready, and the house would be about 70 degrees, lights off. She had this down to a science. So I would eat a lot and then go to sleep, and I'd wake up and go home, and then I would eat again. It was a really bad system. But when I looked in the mirror, especially post-high school graduation, through college, and even now, I would look in the mirror and I was like, man, you got to lose some weight. You really have no reason to be this big anymore. You used to have the excuse of football, but now you're just big. You're just big. You're not even strong anymore, really. But when I looked in the mirror, I acknowledged that I needed to lose weight, and I knew that I needed to, but I didn't do anything about it. So guess what happened? I continued to gain weight. There was no use in me acknowledging that I had this problem, even though it made me uncomfortable, even though it made other people uncomfortable. It didn't really make any sense to acknowledge the problem unless I was going to decide to do something about it. So I can have all the knowledge in the world about something, but until I decide to do something about it, it's useless. But moving forward in the text, we see James kind of propose two ends of a spectrum of people who showed their faith by their actions. On one end, we have Abraham, Father Abraham, great guy. We all know him. But on the other end, James talks about Rahab, the prostitute. He's like, James, what you doing? If you're trying to prove a point, I think you could have just stuck with Abraham. They would have got the point. The readers of this letter would have known exactly who Abraham was. They would have respected him. They would have revered him. But James took it a step further when he brings up Rahab. And to me, this is significant because it shows us that you can be the most respectable person in the world, or you can have a job where people look down on you, but your faith in God still calls you to action. There's no excuse to have faith. There's no excuse to be aware of a problem and do nothing about it. So my question for you, church, the question that I have for myself, the question that I have for whoever's watching, whoever hears this later, is what good is it to denounce racism if we're not going to do anything about it? What good is it to denounce racism if we're not going to do anything about it? If we can all agree that our faith tells us that our faith in God, that we can look at the life of Jesus and we can see that racism is wrong, how do our works back it up? What are we doing actively to denounce racism in our church, in our community, in our families, at our jobs, in our friend groups? What are we doing? And this is something that I've had to ask myself, Jalen, what are you doing? I can tell you right now, if you do a quick scan of the room, I'm the only black person in here. It is very uncomfortable for me to be having this conversation, but it's a conversation that needs to be had. And I know that if you turn on the TV or you get on any social media platform, you can see what the media is feeding. And I'm sure in some of you, there may be defense mechanisms jumping up. It's an election year. Politics have found their way into everything. Politics seem to be interwoven into everything that we do. And sometimes it's laughable. I think one time on Facebook, somebody was like, man, it sure is hot today. And somebody comments like, yeah, man, those liberals. I was like, what? What are you talking about? But it's just like politics has found its way into everything. And after the murder of George Floyd, it seemed like America erupted into this division more than it already was. We had left versus right, black versus white, Republican versus Democratic, cops versus the world, and it's just like, when does it stop? But then something did start to happen. Some people did start to cling together, but then some people still had things that did not allow them to come together. And before we move forward in this message, before I continue, there's just a few things that I want to address, a few things that I want to kind of get out of the way, because sometimes I believe they stop us from doing something when, in fact, it has nothing to do with it at all. The first is this. Some black people have prospered in America, but that does not mean that there are others that are still facing oppression and racism. There are black millionaires, there are black billionaires, and they have resources that none of us has probably seen. But that does not say, okay, because he made it, all of you have no excuse. It's not how this works. There's still NBA players who make millions of dollars every year, money that I would never see in my lifetime unless the Lord wants to bless me with that, whatever he wants to do. And they still talk about their experiences to this day of how they face racism, because it doesn't matter that they're really good at their job or what they do, because when they're out on the street, oftentimes they are just another black person. So let's get that out of the way. Number two, not all cops are bad. I love cops. One of my best friends, I was in his wedding last year, is a cop. Throughout this whole process of police brutality and police reform, I've had conversation after conversation after conversation with him. I was like, help me understand what you see. Help me understand your experiences and what you live. And I hear about the uncomfortable situations that he is put in. And I pray for him every day, because I know what he has to go into every single day. And as I'm sitting in my comfortable office, I know that he is putting his life on the line for his community. But even then, he knows, and I've heard other officers say, that sometimes the system does not allow them to do the job that they signed up to do. And there's some people who join the force to abuse that power. But that should not allow us to stop doing something about the problems in America. My next point, I don't believe all white people are racist. I don't think most people believe all white people are racist. I can admit, growing up, as a defense mechanism, I faced so much racism that I just assumed every white person was racist, and if they weren't, hallelujah. But if they were, I wouldn't be surprised. But I had to break away from that tendency, because that was not the most loving thing that I could do. But I'm telling you now that I don't believe this, and most people don't believe this. But when we are silent and we turn a blind eye to what's happening, it is painful. And my last thing is this. Everyone is working hard. One of the things I continue to see a lot is people just want handouts and an easy way. And I can tell you, from my personal experiences, from what I've seen, from what I've heard, when I listen to people, most people don't want handouts or an easy path in life. They just want to be seen as human. They just want to be able to go in the store and not be followed. They just want to be able to walk down the street. They just want to be able to jog. They just want to be able to breathe. This is not about having passes in life. It's about being able to live a life that we were promised. And some of you may be saying, but Jalen, I've never done any of these things. I'm not racist. I've never done things personally. I'm a good person. And to you, I would say, great. Thank you. But it does not give us a pass to not do anything. A lot of times in life, we walk with people in their pain with stuff that we never caused. I've been blessed to be in positions of leadership all the time where I walk with people who had pain and sorrow from past experiences that I had nothing to do with, but I walked with them because that's what we are called to do. People are hurting. It is so easy to make this about politics. It is so easy to kind of put this in a neat box and say, all of you doing this, and this is why it's really not that bad. But people are hurting. So when people say Black Lives Matters, they're not saying your life doesn't matter. They're saying our life is hurting. My life is hurting. I've lived experiences. It's like I talked to some of my friends who are white, and they're like, you've gone through that? I was like, yeah, this is not normal. And I know that there's a lot of controversy around the Black Lives Matter organization. I'm not blind to that. But for me, I remove the sentiment from the organization to say, you can have the organization, you can say what you want. But when people say this, they're talking about the pain they endure every single day. But even then, if you cannot come to grips with saying Black Lives Matters, that's perfectly fine with me, because at the end of the day, I could care less. But if all lives matters, why can we not walk with people? If all lives matters, why can't we listen to the experiences of other people? If all lives matter, why do we refuse to step out of our comfort zone and walk with the other? Romans 12 says this in verses 15 and 16. For if your brother or sister is hurt, that is not the right verse. Romans 12, it says, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. Live in harmony with one another. Do not be proud. Instead, associate with the humble. Do not be wise in your own estimation. I'm all about numbers and statistics and the facts. But life experiences cannot be put in this chart and analytics. The things that I've been through, I can't export a chart and say, hey man, this is what I've experienced. No, we all have different life experiences. I cannot tell you what you've been through in your life by looking at a chart and saying, well, these are the numbers. Great. But that's not how we work. We are complex beings. And at the end of the day, I want all people to be able to feel the love that they were created to feel. But if you look at the history of America, Black people have not always gotten that benefit. Racism was planted in the foundation of our country, and we must unearth it rather than continue to treat the spots that come above the surface. Because oftentimes it's like, okay, this weed is here, we'll pull it up. We're good. But that's not how it's worked. Free the slaves, cool. It's not as simple as treating the things that come above the surface. I think I shared this before, but when I first told my dad about this job, he was like, oh, that sounds really cool. He's like, where's the church? I was like, Cumming, Georgia, Forsyth County. He said, Forsyth County? He said, they run off Oprah. And I was like, bro, what are you talking about? And I looked it up, and in 87, Oprah came here to Forsyth County because of the history of racism here. And that there still weren't many Black people that moved back to the area because of the deep-rooted racism that was here. And you may think I'm crazy, but when I read this, I knew that I was supposed to be here. I knew that I was supposed to be here because I grew up in a town that didn't have integrated proms until 2002. 2002. I attended a church that if I had tried to go there 5 or 10 years before, they wouldn't have let me in. But because of those life experiences, I knew that I was supposed to be here. Every single Black adult that my mom and dad talk to and tell them that I'm living in Forsyth County, they say, "Are you crazy? Forsyth County?" But I knew that I was supposed to be here. And while I've been here, I can honestly say that I haven't faced the opposition that I thought I would. But I see what happens on Facebook. I see the rhetoric people use. I see things that have happened in just the past couple of years. And my friends my age are worried and like, "Hey man, you need to be careful." But the thing is, I'm not just here to beat anyone over the head or make anyone feel guilty or make you feel bad about the life that you've lived. But I'd be remiss if I did not give practical steps, practical things that I feel like can get us going on the right direction. So I have 4 things that I would encourage all of you to do, and I will continue to do myself, before we can do something as a church together corporately. The first thing is reflect on your own life and acknowledge blind spots. Over the past few weeks, I've had conversation after conversation after conversation after conversation after conversation with people. And they're like, "Jalen, tell me about your life and your experiences." And these are people who I respect, people who have fought to have diverse communities around them, people who champion people of color having a voice. And even these people are like, "Wow, I did not understand that it was this bad." Because they understood everybody has a hard life, everyone has challenges, but they also knew that they didn't have to face similar challenges because of the color of their skin. And I think sometimes it's easy to miss that because we say, "I worked hard for what I have." I've worked hard for what I have. It was not easy to find myself in the rooms that I was in, but sometimes it was harder because of the color of my skin, and sometimes it's good to reflect and acknowledge those blind spots. Point 2, don't make yourself the exception to the reality that racism still exists. Oftentimes people are like, "I'm not racist, my family's not racist, so I don't really think it's that big of a problem." Even though I just told you story after story after story of what I've lived, and I have friends who have story after story after story. And it's just like, this is the life that we have to live. And we can't just kind of turn it off. It's just like, "Oh man, I don't think I want to be black today." No, I don't have that option. And it's really easy to say, "This doesn't exist in my life, so it's not relevant anymore." That's how things used to be. It's not the truth of the matter. Things are still happening to this day. Get on my Twitter, you'll see it. Get on my Facebook, you'll see it. Play Call of Duty, you will hear it. It is there. Point 3, have tough conversations with family and friends who use racist rhetoric. Sometimes this can be really uncomfortable because we often have older family members or maybe younger family members. I know there's been many times where I've gone over to a friend's house and they're like, "Okay, I just want you to know, my Uncle Bob's here. He's a little stuck in his ways. So if he says something, don't be offended by it." It's time to call Uncle Bob out. It's time to have those conversations. It's no longer acceptable that someone's just stuck in their ways. Old school, he grew up in a different time. Okay? Galatians 6 tells us to hold people accountable. Matthew 18 tells us to rebuke someone who sinned against you. It is a biblical practice to keep people accountable and call them out on their sin. And if you think racism is a sin, this is not something that we get a pass on. But that brings me to my last point. Listen to stories from people of color. You may disagree, you may not understand, you may get upset, but it's important to listen to the lives of people who have different experiences. There are books, there are movies, poetry, podcasts of people putting their pain out there, And I think it's important to listen, because until you hear somebody else's experiences, it's hard to believe because it is not your reality. I asked a few of my friends if they would be willing to share just a couple stories, nothing too crazy, of things that they've experienced, things that they've seen and endured in America. And I'm going to actually share some of those with you. The first is my friend Harsh. He's Indian, and he said the first thing, he said back when 9/11 happened, he said he remembered his family getting calls, people threatening his life, people telling him, you need to go back to where you came from. He's like, I've been to India twice. I was born here. I'm an American citizen. Yet someone is telling me that I need to go back where I came from or they'll kill me. More recently, he was at a retreat with our college ministry, and he said there's like 40 of them in his Zaxby's, and he said they're getting kind of loud because it's 40 college students. And he said this lady across from him says, y'all need to be quiet. I am trying to have lunch with my granddaughter. And they're like, okay, it's 40 of us. Sorry about it. And then the manager came over and was like, no, y'all are fine. Like, it's okay. Like, it's 40 of y'all. It's kind of hard to be quiet because it's 40 of you. So they were like, okay. They got back to their conversations. And they walk outside, and they see this guy with his little daughter standing by their bus. And he says they kind of get close, and when the guy looks up and sees them, he kind of walks away. And he passes the guy who has his young daughter with him, and he just looks at him and says, go back to India, and curses at him. And he says in the moment, he was kind of just shocked. He was just like, this guy doesn't know me. He doesn't know where I come from. But he was bold enough to look me in my eyes with his young daughter by his side and said, go back to India. Another story, my friend Najari grew up in Decatur. He's a youth pastor now, too smart for his own good. And he was telling me just a small story about how there's multiple times he would go in the store and he would be shopping. He would get followed and kind of get hurried out or asked, do you have enough money to pay for that? And he would look around, there's a store full of people, and he's like, nobody else is going to ask these questions. But after it happened, time and time again, it became pretty obvious why it was happening. He shared another story he said that growing up, he noticed the disparities between the education he was getting and maybe the education other friends were getting that went to different schools. And he says as he grew up, he found himself in more diverse areas. And what people meant as compliments came off really offensive because they would tell him, man, Najari, you're really articulate for a black guy. Or you're really smart for a black guy. What does that mean? I've been told that many times in life. I was like, what does that mean? My last friend, he asked that I not share his name, but he told me 3 stories, starting in middle school and kind of working backwards. He said in middle school he was visiting this church with a friend. He says predominantly white church. And he said when I say predominantly white, he says I was the black guy. And he says the pastor's kind of making jokes and talking about Daniel, and he was like, we got Shadrach, Meshach, and the one bad Negro. And everybody's just laughing. They think this is the funniest thing in the world. But he's just sitting there, it's like, I don't get it. What's so funny? And then he tells me about the story when he's in elementary school. And he said he's sitting there, and this girl walks to him, and she's like, hey, you want to know something? He was like, what? She was like, I would date you if you weren't black. What does that mean? And then he tells me the story about this time that he was in kindergarten. And he said him and his friend were walking, they were about to get their breakfast. and he says, two white boys in front of him, turned around, looks at them, and just calls them the N-word, hard ER. In kindergarten. And he's confused and shocked. And why would you call me that? Where did you learn this from? And the unfortunate thing is, in each of their stories, I could relate to because I shared those same experiences. We can't keep saying this is isolated or it's not that big of a problem because it has permeated our culture and we have to do something about it. For me, it comes down to this. If we are truly chasing after God's heart, if we are truly wanting to be the church that God calls us to do, we cannot continue to ignore the problems in our world. I believe that God is blessing Canvas Christian. I truly do. But we have to be willing to walk beside people in their pain. We cannot continue to politicize it. We cannot continue to dismiss it because so-and-so has on a nice pair of shoes, so it can't be that bad. We can't do that any longer. And as we saw earlier, the greatest of the great and the lowest of the lows both proved their faith by their actions. Prayer is great. We did a study on prayer. We know how powerful prayer can be. I don't want to deny that fact. But Jesus called us to act. So let's be the church.